Yeah, you're excited to get going? You should be, because this is going to be fun. In this lesson, we'll learn about setting up the focal length of the viewport camera, using the grid to help with proportions, moving from big shapes to small shapes and how that translates from low resolution to high resolution, the grab brush and using it to create our first shape, and finally how we can use the shrink wrap modifier to check our progress. Have fun. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a cube. So I'll press Shift A, Mesh, then click on Cube. Now you might be wondering why I haven't added a sphere, given that the head obviously lends itself more to a spherical shape, and we'll get to that later. But for now, the next thing I want to do is set the focal length of our viewport camera. Now if you look at this viewport, you can think about this as looking through the lens of the camera. So setting the focal length affects how we perceive our model, so it's quite important. If you've done a bit of photography in the past, you'll probably be familiar with how the focal length works. If not, for now just know that the higher this number is, the flatter the image is going to appear. And in photography, different lenses tend to be used for different styles of photography. Since I'm doing a portrait illustration, I'm interested in the sorts of lenses used for portrait photography. And a common lens is 85mm, so that's what I'm going to set the viewport camera to. So let's do that. I'll press N to open up this side panel. Then I'll come over to the View tab, and you'll see at the top that we have our focal length. And at the minute it's set to 50mm. So I'll just change that to 85. Now 85 might not be the final render, but it's going to be around that area. So it's a good idea to have it in the ballpark of what you think the final render is going to be. Right, so next I want to jump into a front view. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. The way that I usually do it is by pressing 1 on the numpad. Now you might be using a laptop, so you might not have a numpad. Another way of getting there is by pressing the backtick key or the tilde key, which is that little annoying button next to the number 1 underneath the escape key. It's annoying because it's really hard to describe because it's different on different keyboards. But anyway, you press that and you'll notice you get this menu pop up in the 3D viewport, which has all these different views. You just want to select front. Now, if you've ever been to a life drawing class, you'll have been taught how to measure proportions by using your pencil like this. But working digitally is a little bit easier. We get sort of tools in the software that help us be a little bit more exact with this. And the tool I'm going to use in Blender is this grid that you can see in the background. And what we can do with this is sort of compare it with the grid in the background of our reference model to help us keep us on track with our proportions. Now at the minute these squares are a little bit too small, so what I want to do is make them a bit bigger, and the way we do that is by coming up here into the overlays and turning this subdivisions down, but you can see it's grayed out, and if I change this it doesn't actually do anything. So to fix that we need to come down here to our Scene Properties tab, and then underneath Units, a unit system, set this to none, and then that will allow us to change this. And I'm just going to change it right down to 1, and notice how we have these really big squares now. And also notice how our cube sits perfectly into this grid of 4 squares. And for the remainder of this tutorial, I'm going to call this grid of 4 squares our home grid, so remember that. An important concept in digital sculpting that's really going to help you out is this idea of moving from big to small, so sort of big shapes to small shapes. The example I always give is, imagine a person walking towards you from a distance. When they're really far away, you can just about make out the outline or the silhouette. Silhouette's quite an important word in sculpting too. And then as they get closer towards you, you start to make out more and more details, and it's not until they're right up close to you that you can see little things like pores or wrinkles or stuff like that. And that's the approach you want to take when you're sculpting a character. You want to try and find the biggest shapes first and then gradually move towards the smaller. And this is going to be echoed in your polygon management as well. So you want to start with a really small amount of polygons, so really big polygons. Then as you progress your sculpt, you have more and more polygons that get smaller and smaller, so you can fit in more details like wrinkles and pores. And essentially, you need to aim to be using the least number of polygons possible to achieve the shape that you're trying to achieve. At the minute, if I rotate around this, you'll see we have 6 polygons, 6 faces on this square. And we're trying to achieve this shape off to the side, so we definitely need a few more. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to come over to my modifiers tab, and I'm going to add a subdivision surface, which is going to subdivide the model, as the name implies, and it's also going to smooth it as well. Okay, this is a bit better. We've got a little bit more to work with. Not quite enough yet though. So I'm going to turn the levels up to 3, which gives us a little bit more to play with. However, if we try and sculpt on this, we're going to run into a problem, and that's because this geometry isn't actually real. The modifier is creating an illusion that we have more geometry, but we don't actually. You can see that if I turn this off, that we revert right back to our cube. If I try to sculpt on this, in fact, if I turn on the wireframe, you can see that the wireframe only draws around parts of the mesh. If this doesn't make sense, you'll see what I mean in a second. So the way we get around this is by applying the modifier, and what that'll do is make the geometry real. Now I want you to look at the wireframe when I do this so that it makes a bit more sense. You see what I mean now? All this geometry is real, and if I came to sculpt on it, we would actually be able to. What I'm going to do now is just press 1 to get back into my front view. And notice, since it's smoothed the model, it's actually shrunk a little bit, so it's not neatly in our home grid as it was before. But that's fine. What I'm going to do is move it to the top of this grid by pressing G, right, which allows me to move it. Then Z, which constrains it to the Z axis, and then I can move it to the top. And if I press Shift, I can actually move this more slowly, which allows me to get this just right. So now we're finally ready to start sculpting on this. So for that, we want to jump into sculpt mode, and as with many things with Blender, there's a couple of ways of doing this. You can either come up here to the top left and select sculpt mode. Alternatively, and the way I like to do it, is by pressing the hotkey Control Tab while your cursor's over the 3D viewport, and then you can select from the different modes here. And that's just a bit of a quicker way of doing it. Now you should see all of these brushes appear off to the left, and if you move your cursor to the side until these arrows appear, you can drag it across and you can see all the names, and you'll notice there's quite a few of them. Don't be intimidated by this. What you'll find when you're sculpting is that you'll tend to only use 4 or 5 brushes to create the whole thing, and in fact, for this shape we're creating here, I'm only actually going to use one, the grab brush. So honestly, it's nothing to be worried about. Just select the grab brush, which I already have selected, and then make sure you turn symmetry on as well, because at the minute we're just affecting one side. We want to have symmetry on so we're not doing everything twice. It also just keeps everything clean. So now, purely for you this, I'm going to move my brush to the middle of the home grid. Okay, and the reason I've done that is so that you can use the grid to help you determine how big I'm going to make the brush, because we're going to resize the brush here. The way we're going to do that is by pressing the hotkey F. You can come up here to radius and do it that way. I wouldn't recommend that though. That's a pain. That you want to be using the hotkey. So I'll do that, and you want it so it's roughly about this size in relation to the home grid. Okay, so around about there. Then what I'm going to do is bring the brush down to roughly here on the topology. I'm going to mark this out so you can see what I'm seeing. So I'm coming in from the side here to where this pole is on the topology, and then coming to the middle. This is where I'm putting my cursor. And all I want to do is press down and drag it until we reach the bottom of this grid. And that's the height of our head sorted. Now we want to sort the width. So for this, I'm going to come over to my overlays again, and I'm going to turn subdivisions up to 2, just temporarily while we find the width. And what I'm looking for is to have the width roughly 2 grid squares here. So you can see how the grid squares are smaller now. We want 2 of those. So I'll just drag that in from the side, and that's the width sorted. And I can change this back. Okay, spot on. And notice how that roughly correlates with what we've got over here as well. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're actually sculpting now. This is exciting. Right, so we've got our height and we've got our width. We now want the length. So I'm going to come to a side view for that. For that, I'm going to press 3 on the numpad. Again, you can use the backtick key and sort of choose it from that menu. And what I want to highlight is a really important loop, which is this loop right here. And this is the reason why I didn't start with a sphere at the beginning, is because you wouldn't get this topology, but with a cube you do. And what this is going to do is help us find key features of the face, because this loop is going to be the perimeter of our face. So at the bottom here, this is going to be where our chin is. Where it turns here, that's going to be the corner of our jaw. And then at the top, that's going to be where our hairline is. Now, the topology is going to change. We are going to remesh this later, if you know what that means. And so this will change, but for now, we can use it to our advantage to find key points of the face. So I'll go back into sculpt mode, go back to a side view. And what I want to do is, looking at my reference, I'm just going to make this brush a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to bring this forward so that our chin is at the front. Now the next thing I want to do is make sure the corner of the jaw is back here, and look where it is in relation to the center here. It's almost to the center. Now I could just drag this across like that and make it a bit neater, but the problem with doing something like this purely from a side view is as soon as we turn it, it doesn't look right. The face is too thin and the jaw's too thin, as well. The jaw's wider than that. To avoid issues like this, what you generally do when you're sculpting is try and find a better angle from which to make the stroke. So an angle like this would be a bit better, because then at least it's being pulled backwards and outwards at the same time. But also, you just want to make little strokes and rotate, little stroke, rotate, little stroke. Just keep doing that until you get it to the position you want it to be, and then you know, just sort of tease it towards where you want it to be, like this. So I'm just moving slowly. Well, I'm actually moving quite quickly, but take as much time as you need. And again, don't forget what we're aiming to do is recreate what we can see on the left side of the screen here. You always want to make sure it's looking right from all angles. And that's where these reference meshes help, because you can actually rotate around these and see how they look from any given angle, which is always going to help. Okay, let's take that back to a side view. Now if I look at my front view, I'm seeing that in the reference there's a taper downwards towards the corners of the jaw, and then more of a taper down towards the chin. But at the minute, I'm missing that taper. So I just want to make sure I've got that in. I'm going to bring back our subdivision again, just to make sure I'm keeping the width where it should be. It looks good. Give it more of a chin. Again, make sure you're rotating around the model. Now from a top view, we want to have an egg shape. It's a bit off at the minute. So I'll just tweak that. And then just check it from here. See if it looks right. Not too bad. Okay, so I'm reasonably happy with where I am there. Let's just drift in a little bit from the proportions. Okay, that's a bit better. Bring the subdivisions back down to 1. Now, from a side view, you can see that I actually need to bring this cranium up here. So I'll do that. Again, always rotating around the model, making sure it looks right from all angles. Now, the more you do this, the less you'll need to use the reference to get to where you want to be. So I find myself not actually looking at this too much now, but that's just because I've done this so many times at this point, just recording this tutorial. Now, once you've got something you're reasonably happy with, you can actually use these reference images over to the side to check how well you did. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to jump into object mode, and I'm going to add a shrink wrap modifier to this. Now what I'm going to do is select the eyedropper, then select our reference head, and once I click this, you're going to see it jump because I think I'm quite off. You see how that jumped there? And we can toggle this just by clicking this icon here, and you can see the differences between the reference and what I'd sculpted. And we can even go one step further with this and select this little arrow here and select apply as shape key. And what we can do now is come over to our object data properties, select shrink wrap, and then we can slide between our sculpt and the reference. And this just allows us to see how close we got and what we need to remember for next time. And it just really helps you sort of understand where you're off. I mean, don't expect to get this absolutely perfect. There's bound to be some differences. But yeah, quite a useful little tool. And that's it. That's shape one in the bag. And what I recommend you do before moving on to shape 2 is just try recreating this shape from a sphere at least 5 times so you get a better feel for the process. If you want to do it more than 5 times, go ahead. Eventually you'll want to have this done 100 times anyway. When you're ready, I'll see you for shape 2.